He thought she was just another black woman he could intimidate until she walked into court and destroyed his career. A routine traffic stop turns into a nightmare of power abuse, injustice, and revenge. But this time the wrong woman got arrested. Watch till the end to see how she turns the game around. Like and subscribe to catch more real-life stories that demand justice. The Sirens in the Dark. It was the kind of night that swallowed sound. The rain had stopped hours ago, but the slick roads still shimmered under the flickering glow of the streetlights. The highway stretched ahead, empty except for the occasional truck rumbling past in the opposite lane. Lieutenant Commander Rachel Dawson exhaled softly, her fingers drumming idly against the steering wheel as an old jazz tune crooned through the speakers. She wasn't in uniform tonight, just a simple black sweater and jeans. Hair pulled back, no makeup, nothing to make her stand out. Just another black woman driving alone at night. At least that's how she figured the world saw her. She had been on the road for nearly 2 hours, making her way home after a long week of high-stakes meetings with military brass. The real kind of power, men who could order fleets across the world with a single phone call. Rachel had sat among them, not as an outsider, but as one of them. But out here on this dark, empty highway, none of that mattered. That was the problem with power. It only worked when people recognized it. And then red and blue lights exploded in her rearview mirror. Rachel's pulse remained steady, but she felt it. That sharp twist in her gut, that deep, ingrained knowledge that something about this wasn't right. She wasn't speeding. She wasn't swerving. Her car, a meticulously maintained black Audi, was flawless. So why was she being pulled over? She knew why. Her stomach clenched, not out of fear, but exhaustion. Not tonight. With a practiced calm, she signaled, eased onto the shoulder, and put the car in park. 2 deep breaths. She knew the routine. Hands visible. No sudden movements. Don't reach for anything until asked. Be predictable. A white patrol car rolled to a stop behind her. And then, nothing. No officer approached. Rachel kept her hands on the wheel, eyes flicking to the rearview mirror. The silhouette of the cop was visible in the driver's seat, watching her, testing her patience. It was a power play. She had seen this before, not just in the military, but in the real world, in places where men with badges learned to play judge, jury, and executioner under the cover of darkness. 30 seconds, 1 minute. Finally, the driver's side door creaked open. Heavy boots hit the pavement, slow, deliberate. A man who expected obedience. Rachel's jaw tightened as she caught sight of him in her side mirror. Officer Stephen Briggs, white, mid-40s, broad shoulders, the kind of guy who enjoyed this part of the job. The flashlight clicked on. The beam cut through her side window, hitting her square in the face. She didn't flinch. A long pause. Then, his voice flat and impatient. License and registration. No greeting, no explanation. Rachel kept her movements slow and deliberate as she reached for her glove compartment. Everything about her was controlled. She handed over the documents, her voice steady. Was I speeding, officer? Briggs didn't answer right away. He took the papers, held them just out of reach, and gave her car a once-over. Tail lights out. Rachel's brows furrowed. Bullshit. Her car had been serviced 2 weeks ago. Everything was in perfect condition. She knew it, and he knew it. That can't be right, she said, keeping her tone neutral. Briggs finally looked at her, his smirk sharp and condescending. Are you arguing with me? A beat of silence. Rachel could feel it, the air between them shifting. That unspoken moment where power met resistance, and one side expected the other to cave. She had seen it before, overseas in military interrogations, in war zones where authority meant survival. She knew this game. Her mind calculated the options. Push back and risk escalation. Comply and give him control. Neither choice was acceptable. Instead, she held her ground. I'm just saying, she replied, voice calm but firm. My car was inspected recently, but if there's a problem, I can get it fixed. Wrong answer. Briggs' smirk vanished. His jaw ticked. Step out of the vehicle. Rachel exhaled slowly. Number not like this. She flicked her eyes toward the road ahead. No witnesses, no dashboard cameras in sight. Rachel tapped her fingers on the steering wheel once. twice, thinking. Then she reached for the door handle. Mind telling me why? Briggs tilted his head, that smug grin creeping back. Because I said so. Rachel clenched her jaw, feeling her heartbeat pick up, not out of fear, but calculated anticipation. This wasn't just a traffic stop. This was a trap, but Briggs had no idea who he was dealing with, because this time he had pulled over the wrong woman. The nightmare at the station. The night air was cool, crisp, but thick with something else. Rachel Dawson felt it the moment her boots hit the pavement. Not fear, not panic. Something deeper, a knowing. This wasn't just about a taillight. This wasn't about a routine stop. This was a game, and Officer Stephen Briggs was the kind of man who played to win. The power struggle begins. Rachel stood still, her posture controlled, her breaths even. She had learned long ago that fear is a currency, and men like Briggs traded in it. Not tonight. Briggs took a step closer. His presence loomed, his shadow stretching long across the asphalt under the flashing red and blue lights. Turn around, hands on the car. Rachel hesitated, just enough to make a point. For what reason? Briggs's smirk vanished. Wrong question. His hand dropped to his belt, fingers grazing his holster. The movement was subtle, a threat without words. Are you resisting? Rachel met his eyes, steady. Number, I'm asking a question. A flicker of something crossed his face. Annoyance, amusement, both. Then, without warning, he reached for his radio. Dispatch, I got a non-compliant driver here. His voice was low, smug. Rachel's pulse picked up, but she didn't move. She wasn't stupid. She knew how this could go. She knew how this usually went. She had seen the news, the names, the faces, the ones who didn't walk away. Not tonight. Rachel exhaled slowly, lifting her hands where he could see them. Then, without another word, she turned, placed her hands on the roof of her car. Cold metal against her palms. A choice made. And yet it didn't matter. Briggs yanked her arms behind her back, snapping cold steel cuffs around her wrists. Too tight. On purpose. Rachel clenched her jaw. Don't react. Briggs shoved her forward, nearly making her stumble. You don't know what you're doing, she murmured. Briggs chuckled. Lady, I know exactly what I'm doing. But he didn't. Not even close. Locked up with no way out. The back seat of the patrol car was harder than she remembered. Rachel had been in worse places. Combat drills, high-risk operations, interrogations in foreign territories. But this was different, because this wasn't war. This was her own country, a place that was supposed to be safe. The patrol car lurched forward, speeding down the highway. Outside, the world blurred past in streaks of red and white. Inside, Briggs whistled a low, mocking tune. Rachel didn't say a word, didn't move. Briggs finally glanced at her through the rearview mirror. Most people just keep their mouths shut when I tell them to step out. Rachel exhaled sharply through her nose. And most officers don't arrest people for questioning a traffic stop. Briggs laughed. Lady, you must really think you're somebody. Rachel met his eyes in the mirror. I don't think. I know. And for the first time, Briggs' smirk flickered. Just for a second, his knuckles flexed around the wheel. Rachel watched it happen. That tiny, imperceptible crack in his confidence. She made a mental note. Good. The station and the real nightmare begins. The police station loomed ahead, a squat gray building with buzzing fluorescent lights. The parking lot was mostly empty, no witnesses. Rachel was the only guest tonight. Briggs parked in a reserved spot, killed the engine, and turned to look at her through the partition. Gotta say, he murmured, I do love when they make it easy. Rachel didn't react, didn't give him the satisfaction. Instead, she waited. The door swung open. Let's go. Rachel stepped out, her wrists already raw from the cuffs. Inside, the station smelled like old coffee and sweat. A bored-looking desk sergeant barely glanced up. Routine. They had done this before. Rachel could feel it. Briggs uncuffed her just long enough to push her through booking. Fingerprints, mugshot, paperwork. All the while he hovered, like a predator with nowhere to be. When it was over, he grabbed her wrist again, his grip too tight. "Think you're smart, huh?" he muttered under his breath. Rachel turned slightly. "I don't have to think." His grip tightened. She knew that got under his skin. Good, because Rachel hadn't even started yet. Briggs's worst fear comes true. Hours passed. Rachel sat in the holding cell, watching, waiting. Through the bars, she heard the faint murmurs of officers chatting, the occasional shuffle of paperwork, the clatter of a coffee cup against a desk. She exhaled slow and steady. Control the breathing. Control the mind. Basic training. Then, heavy footsteps. Briggs. She knew it was him before he even came into view. His stride had that same arrogant rhythm, the kind of walk that said, "I own this place." He stopped in front of the cell, arms crossed, smirk back in place. "Comfy?" Rachel didn't answer, didn't give him the satisfaction. He tilted his head, stepping closer to the bars. "You know, if you just played along, you wouldn't be in here right now." Rachel let a slow smile curl at the edges of her lips. "Oh, I'm exactly where I need to be." And for the first time, Briggs hesitated. Just a flicker, a beat too long before he spoke, before he could cover it up. But Rachel caught it. She had already won, because right then, a young officer appeared in the hallway. Nervous, holding a clipboard. Sergeant?" Briggs barely glanced at him. "What?" The officer shifted uncomfortably. "We got a call. I think you need to see this." Briggs frowned. The young officer hesitated, then lowered his voice. Rachel didn't catch the words. She didn't need to, because she saw it. She saw the moment Briggs's world cracked open. His face darkened. His jaw tightened. And then, without another word, he turned and stormed out. Rachel exhaled. It wouldn't be long now, because Briggs had no idea what was coming next. And by the time the night was over, he would regret every single decision that led him here. The fall of a badge. The tides begin to turn. Rachel Dawson sat still in the cold holding cell, watching shadows shift under the fluorescent lights outside. Her wrists still ached from the tight cuffs. The metallic tang of stale coffee and disinfectant lingered in the air. But she wasn't thinking about the pain. She was thinking about the game. Because that's what this was. A game of power. And Briggs thought he had already won. He thought she was just another black woman. Alone, helpless, with no one coming for her. He was wrong. Briggs' first warning. Briggs stormed out of the hallway, his heavy boots thudding against the floor. Something was wrong. Rachel saw it in the way his jaw was clenched, the way his fingers curled into fists. He wasn't in control anymore, and he knew it. He stomped toward the young officer who had approached him earlier. "What did you just say to me?" His voice was sharp, cutting through the low murmur of the precinct. The younger officer fidgeted with his clipboard, swallowing hard. "Sir, we got a call. From higher up. Someone's asking questions about the arrest." Briggs's eyes darkened. "Who?" A pause, and then, "The Department of Defense." The words landed like a punch to the gut. Briggs stiffened. His mind raced. What the hell? Who the hell had he just arrested? His eyes darted back toward the holding cell, where Rachel sat calmly, watching him, her expression unreadable. But he knew. She had done this. A bigger problem than he expected. Rachel leaned back against the cold bench, listening. She could hear the phone ringing, officers murmuring. Her name was being said, whispered. Because the more they dug into who she really was, the more they realized they had made a mistake. Briggs had made a huge mistake. A door slammed down the hallway. Briggs was on the phone now. Rachel couldn't hear everything, but she caught the sharpness in his tone. Defensive, frustrated. It was a routine stop. She was being uncooperative. Then, silence. Rachel smirked. Whoever was on the other end wasn't buying it. Briggs slammed the receiver down so hard that a few officers flinched. Rachel watched as he ran a hand down his face, breathing heavily. He was losing control, and then came the moment Rachel was waiting for. Another officer entered, not a rookie, not a desk sergeant, internal affairs. A man in a crisp black suit, no nonsense, with a folder in his hand. He didn't waste time. Sergeant Briggs, we need to talk. Now. Briggs's face went pale. Rachel smiled. Checkmate. The courtroom showdown. The next morning, Rachel wasn't in a cell anymore. She was in a courtroom, but this time, she wasn't the one on trial. Briggs sat across the room, still in uniform, but stiff, tense. His career was on the line. Rachel stood at the defense table, her attorney, Carla Whitman, flipping through a thick stack of files. The judge entered, a sharp, seasoned man who looked like he had seen it all before. Let's get to it. The prosecutor stepped forward, a middle-aged man, slick suit, quick eyes. Your Honor, we have reason to believe that the defendant, Lieutenant Commander Rachel Dawson, was unlawfully detained without probable cause. He paused. Then, the killing blow. Furthermore, new information suggests a pattern of misconduct involving the arresting officer, Sergeant Stephen Briggs. A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Briggs stiffened. Rachel could feel his panic. The judge adjusted his glasses and peered down at Briggs. Sergeant Briggs, care to explain? Briggs leaned forward, clearing his throat. Your Honor, the defendant was uncooperative during a routine traffic stop. The prosecutor raised an eyebrow. Then, without hesitation, he lifted a remote. A screen lowered in the courtroom. A video began to play. The truth exposed. The body cam footage filled the screen. Briggs barking orders. Rachel calm, controlled. The unnecessary escalation. The smug way he had tightened the cuffs. The lies. The room was dead silent as the footage ended. The judge leaned forward, his fingers steepled. Sergeant Briggs. His voice was low, controlled. You violated protocol. You conducted an unlawful arrest, and you failed to report the full details in your initial statement. Briggs opened his mouth, but the judge wasn't done. The charges against Lieutenant Commander Dawson are hereby dismissed. The gavel came down, final, absolute, and then the final blow. I strongly suggest an internal investigation into Sergeant Briggs' conduct. The tension in the room snapped like a rubber band. Briggs looked like he had been punched in the gut. His face burned. His hands clenched into fists. Rachel simply exhaled slowly. She had never doubted the outcome. Because this time, she wasn't the one who had to fight for her reputation. Briggs was. The aftermath and the final twist. Briggs stormed out of the courtroom. His heavy footsteps echoed down the polished hallways. Rachel watched him go, her expression unreadable, because she knew it wasn't over for him, not even close. The real nightmare was just beginning. As he pushed through the courthouse doors, a sharp voice stopped him cold. Sergeant Briggs, he turned. Standing in the lobby was Chief Eldon Baker, the most powerful man in the department. His arms were crossed, his expression unreadable. Follow me. Now. Briggs felt his stomach twist. A door slammed shut behind him. The chief tossed a thick file onto the desk. It landed with a heavy thud. Briggs swallowed hard. His name was all over it. His arrest history, his patterns, the racial profiling reports, and then, the worst part, a single line. The district attorney is reviewing all of your cases from the past 5 years. Briggs's breath hitched. His entire world was unraveling. What does that mean? Chief Baker's voice was flat, cold. It means your career is over. And just like that, Briggs was finished. The victory, and what comes next. The moment of reckoning. The crisp morning air carried a quiet hum as Rachel Dawson stepped out of the courthouse, free. The sky stretched wide, a brilliant shade of blue. The kind of morning that felt like a fresh start. But Rachel wasn't interested in poetic symbolism. She was interested in justice, and justice had just been served. Behind her, reporters swarmed, cameras flashing, microphones being shoved toward her. Lieutenant Commander Dawson, how does it feel to have all charges dropped? Do you believe Sergeant Briggs should be fired? Will you be pressing charges for wrongful arrest? Rachel paused. She could feel every pair of eyes on her, the weight of expectation, the hunger for a soundbite. She took a breath. Then, she simply smiled. I think the footage speaks for itself. A simple, calculated response. The truth was, Rachel had already won. Briggs' career? Ruined. His badge? Suspended, pending investigation. And soon, he'd face criminal charges of his own. Rachel didn't need to bury him. He had done that to himself. She turned, walking down the courthouse steps, leaving the cameras behind. This wasn't about the headlines. This was about something bigger. The final nail in the coffin. Meanwhile, across town, in a dimly lit office inside the Birmingham Police Department, Stephen Briggs sat across from Chief Eldon Baker. His hands were clenched into fists, jaw locked so tight it hurt. The chief sat behind his desk, arms crossed. The silence stretched. Then, Baker finally spoke. "It's over." Briggs stiffened. "Sir, Don't." Baker held up a hand. "Just don't." Briggs swallowed. "They're making a big deal out of nothing. I was doing my damn job." Baker's eyes narrowed. "Your job?" His voice was low, controlled. "Your job is to protect and serve, not to target, harass, and escalate." Briggs' nostrils flared. "That woman was being disrespectful." Baker's chair scraped against the floor as he stood abruptly. Briggs shut up. For the first time since this nightmare started, he felt something dangerous. Fear. The chief leaned forward, his voice like ice. "People like you are why we have a problem, Briggs." A pause. "And let me be very clear, this department isn't going down with you." Briggs' stomach twisted. "What does that mean?" Baker exhaled sharply. "It means you're done." Briggs' world collapsed. "You can't do this. I've served this city for what? Abusing your badge? Racially profiling civilians? Illegally detaining a high-ranking military officer?" The words hit like gunfire. Briggs felt the walls closing in. And then, the final blow. Baker reached into his desk and pulled out a thick manila envelope, slid it across the desk. Briggs stared. He knew what it was before he even touched it. His termination papers. "Sign it." A lump formed in Briggs' throat. His fingers hovered over the envelope. Then, slowly, reluctantly, he picked up the pen. With a single stroke of ink, he lost everything. Rachel's next move across town, Rachel Dawson sat in a quiet cafe, stirring her coffee. Her phone buzzed. She glanced down. A text from Carla Whitman, her attorney. "Briggs has been officially terminated. His record is under review. Possible criminal charges pending." Rachel took a slow sip of her coffee. Good. But she wasn't celebrating, because this fight wasn't just about her. Briggs was just one officer, and there were dozens, hundreds more just like him. She had seen too much, heard too many stories. People without her rank, without her resources, people who never got justice. Rachel leaned back, exhaling slowly. The headlines were already circulating. The footage had gone viral. People were talking, but talking wasn't enough. Action mattered. A call that changes everything. Her phone buzzed again, a number she recognized. She sighed, then answered. "Lieutenant Commander," a familiar voice greeted. Her captain. "I assume you've seen the news." Rachel smirked. "I have." A pause. "And how do you feel?" Rachel glanced out the cafe window, watching the world move on around her. People laughing, walking, living. She thought about that little black boy she had seen crossing the street the day before, holding his mother's hand, carefree. She thought about how one day he would grow up, and how men like Briggs would see him as a threat. Rachel set her coffee down, and when she spoke, her voice was strong, clear, unshaken. "I feel like I did exactly what I was supposed to do." A beat of silence. Then, her captain's voice softened. "That's what I thought you'd say." Another pause. "The Department of Defense is watching this closely. Don't be surprised if they ask you to speak publicly on it." Rachel exhaled through her nose. She wasn't sure she wanted that. She didn't want to be a headline. But the captain was right. This wasn't just about her. "You might also get a call from the mayor's office," the captain added. Rachel raised an eyebrow. "Oh? Seems they want to recognize you for handling the situation with professionalism and grace." Rachel smirked. "Now that's ironic." Her captain chuckled. "So, are you going to accept?" Rachel thought for a moment, then shrugged. "I'll think about it." The final walk away. As she ended the call, Rachel glanced across the street. A young mother walked with her son, his small hand wrapped tightly around hers. He was laughing, carefree. Rachel watched them for a moment, then took a deep breath and walked away, her steps firm, her purpose clear. Because this fight wasn't just hers. It never had been. The final message: power unchecked is power abused, and the only way to change the system is to hold it accountable. Takeaways from the story: justice is only real when it applies to everyone. People in power only fall when someone fights back. Real change doesn't happen from silence. It happens when people refuse to back down. If this story made you think, share it. If it made you angry, talk about it. Because change starts with real conversations, and we still have work to do.